people who work on such different things, I'd kind of wondered whether you might come at it from totally different perspectives, and you did, but there are a lot of overlaps as well. And I'm sure I should say that any of our speakers are happy to take the discussion in any direction that you want to, so don't feel too constrained by the theme that we've set up for this. But I wanted to abuse my chair's privilege and ask something first of all, which was about, I think the thing that all three of you talked about was overlapping and competing narratives. Do you mind passing that to Sherry as well? Thank you. So Charlie talked about all of these multiple narratives in the different periods that you see when you walk through the city. And James, you were talking about explicitly competing narratives about a single event, and Caoimhe, obviously, you were talking about these contested spaces with many different narratives. And I wondered how, as writers, you go about handling those different narratives. Do you have to choose one and kind of have that's the thread, and you say, but there are these other things going on, or how as scholars do you deal with that issue? I don't know if Charlie, do you want to go first?
I can only speak from what I've been working on. Like I say, working on this story of this street in Silvertown and this one community, but I think focusing on a particular street or a particular family, even a particular person, can give you a good way into bigger narratives, bigger themes. Like I said, Silvertown between the wars, you had the general strike, you had the Spanish flu epidemic, all big historical events and themes that when you view them down through that one specific place, that one specific street, you can. I think it makes it more readable. I think it makes a nice narrative if you can follow the same characters, whether they're real or fictional, through those events. And then, because you can then say, well, that's that one street, the same things were happening in the next street, the same things were happening in the street the other side, they were happening in streets all across the city, all across the country. And I think that's the way I prefer to tackle these things.
So if you're in a place like London, for example, where so you referenced all of these different periods, as a writer you find it easier to, or it works better for the kind of story you're telling, to pick one of the periods and sort of walk through that period rather than try and cover all the different bases, as it were?
Yeah, I mean, the book I did where I walked some of the great journeys from history. I walked from, I followed King Harold through from the Battle of Stamford Bridge and walked down to the battlefield for the Battle of Hastings. And although that was my main narrative thread, and I followed the same, well, I kind of identified what was probably the route he took, which would have been the old Roman roads, and thought about the communities he was coming across, and the way the army was structured in those days, where you had the full-time soldiers and you had the kind of equivalent to the territorials, and they'd send out words into the villages for these lads that were trained a bit and would be called up in the event of a big emergency. I think they were called the feared, I think. But and so I used to think about those stories, and I'd pass through villages on the way, and you'd see the village war memorial, which would have mainly, obviously, 1914 to 18, and then you have a few names from 1939 to 1945. And that made me think, well, these are the same kind of guys that would have been marching with Harold's army and would have been, might have been killed on the battlefield at Hastings. So that kind of opened up different periods, different themes. I was making a specific journey in search of a specific person, yet at the same time I'm passing through places and finding echoes from different eras, 1,000 years apart. So I think it's not just exclusively focusing on that one thing. For me, it's that one thing triggering tangents, and the sort of books I write, I'm lucky that I can go off on tangents. But I think it makes for a more rounded narrative, and hopefully a more rounded kind of appreciation of the story I'm trying to tell.
I imagine it works slightly differently.
Well, I've got, even though I'm only working on the fraud cases, I've got hundreds of stories I could tell. Now, I can't tell them all, so I'm going to have to choose some of them, and that's actually part of the academic aim. The reader needs narrative to make sense of the sentences. It's not going to make sense to overwhelm them with too many names and complicated situations. So I'm going to have to pick some of the best stories. In doing so, I'm going to be making a selection, as I talk through each person's story, I'm going to also want to compare to similar experience and practices from the other stories. I'm going to kind of bring them in that way. So there'll be central narratives, maybe addressing a particular theme or particular social type, and within each narrative, which has to be kept together to preserve that kind of embedded sense of economic life, social life, I'll be referring to other stories too. We need like a multiple set of narratives because part of the aim is to cover a social range. So my aim here, as I said in the talk, is I want to demonstrate the segmented nature of the market, and the way people access it depends on class. So I'll be covering a range of different social types. We'll be looking at, say, silk weavers get advanced a bit of silk to work on by the merchants, but they can also raise money by pawning it in the meantime, transform it into cash. We can compare their experience to a merchant who habituates the main central square at St Mark's, who can access the international credit markets using letters of exchange. So I want to explore the different kind of documentary practices, experiences and spatial context of these different stories. So the aim is to give the reader kind of multiple perspectives on this story, and so reveal the workings of the market in that way.
Well, I'm sympathetic to both Charlie's kind of microcosm approach and James's representative approach. In the work that I do, I try and think about these individuals who have lived their lives in these cities, in these violent cities, in the past. I try and think about the extent to which their experiences are representative of other experiences, and also to think about to what extent they are exceptional stories. And I think that's a challenge that I've faced in my earlier work as a biographer as well. It's this tension between to what extent you want to write about ordinary people and what extent you want to write about the exceptional people, and what kind of claims can you make for your work when you're trying to tease that out. We're drawn to the exceptional because in most cases the very fact that we know about these people, they are exceptional in some way. But I think as writers, we don't want to just tell that story of that one person, interesting though it might be. We want to use that person's life narrative or that person's navigations through the city as a lens through which to tell a bigger story. So I'm very conscious of it. It's something that I feel a little bit defensive about, and something that I know that there has to be a kind of intellectual justification for that. And so in each of the cases that I've looked at, each of these different individuals who have been involved in political violence, there is a kind of a challenge to me at the start of each story to set up the justification for having chosen that person.
Yes, and I guess the pressure to justify is maybe slightly less in the case of Charlie's work, but actually all three of you are making the same kinds of choices, I suppose. And I'm very tempted just to kind of ask you to carry on this conversation, because I'm very interested in this, because I'm trying to figure out picking individuals to whose journeys, although in my case they're transatlantic journeys to follow. But I feel like I ought to ask other people if they have questions either for any one or all of our speakers. Or indeed if you have questions for each other. Yes.
I have a question for Charlie. I'm doing my PhD on the history and future management of the River Don, so I'm particularly interested in the history of rivers, and it was interesting that you were talking about the River Thames, and I wanted your opinion on how people who know about the history of the River Thames perceive it differently because of their historical knowledge as it is now and as it could be in the future.
Yeah, I'm quite, obviously I'm very interested in the history of the River Thames. I've a family history on the River Thames that dates back about 400 years through dockers and shipwrights and various sea captains and things like that I've been getting far too stuck into rather than instead of actually doing any proper work. But I think that the thing with rivers is, I mean, a lot of cities are on major rivers, so, you know, and that's why a lot of them are actually there. And I get frustrated in London because I see people walking across London Bridge, walking across Tower Bridge, and they don't look to either side. They're just thinking, I've got to get from one side of the river and I've got to get to the other side of the river. And this river, they don't really take any notice of it. And I think even now there is so much life on the River Thames. Since I've living by it, I've been able to appreciate it even more. There are all sorts of boats going up and down. There's tugs taking big barges of rubbish up and down. There's the clipper boats that are like the commuter services. You get the party boats going up and down. But there's also working boats. They've got the Thames lifeboat by Embankment Station. And I do sometimes want to grab people and say, look what's going on. Look to one side and because there's so much life on the river and there's so much history in the river. Last year I was lucky enough to be on the support boat for the Doggett's Coat and Badge race, which is a race for apprentice watermen on the Thames. And the watermen go back hundreds of years to I think this year might be the 300th anniversary of the Coat and Badge race, but the watermen go back way beyond that. And it's a great London event, and it's not a really popular, it's not a tourist event like the changing of the guard or Buckingham Palace or anything like that. It's I was going to say a proper London event, that's probably the wrong thing to say, but it's a traditional London event that's not a tradition for tradition's sake. They are apprentice watermen doing this thing every year, and it's a really difficult race. It's about 4.5 miles, and they're on their own, and there's about 6 of them every year. And the winner does get this big, lovely red jacket, scarlet jacket with a big silver badge on the sleeve, hence it's the Coat and Badge race. And the previous winners are there and they're wearing theirs. And I remember following this race on the support boat behind it and looking at the banks of the rivers, and there were people walking past and cars going past and buses going past and people going on bikes, and they're just looking ahead of them, and they had no idea that this great historic event was being perpetuated on the river next to them. And I find that very, very frustrating. Because it's an old cliche, but the river is a real artery for a city, and an artery in lots of different ways. And literally the history comes out of the mud. You see, there's mudlarks on the Thames all the time coming up with all sorts of fascinating things that are washed up on the tide, and it's just it does my head in sometimes, because I want people to just take note of what's going on the river, because it's still a living thing. It's still a living highway, and it's the thing that founded the city that you live in. The reason your city grew up is because of this river that's there. So, I hats off to you for covering that kind of thing in your work. I don't know if that answered the question anyway, but I got a bit carried away. But yeah, hats off to rivers is the message from me.
Holden, do you mind if Claudia just passes?
Sure. Yeah, what I found really interesting in this talk is that cities are about also the meanings that we ascribe to them, and we can have different interpretations about what space means. One thing that caught my attention was actually something that Caoimhe mentioned, because she was talking about places like Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, as well as Belfast. And for me, those cities are, yes, we could call them violent cities because there's violence that happens there, but they're also colonial cities. We can, depending on the way we characterize the city, it shifts our attention completely to something else. If we start thinking of them as a colonial city, as a Palestinian, for example, I can't think of a place like Tel Aviv except as a colonial place, because it was there to erase Jaffa. Jaffa is the real city there, the historic place, and then in the 1920s and 30s, the settler community from Europe goes and constructs a whole new place that eventually eats it up and destroys it and turns the remains of it into an artist colony. So it becomes like this, the way we conceptualize it affects the way we think about space, and also how we feel about space. And I think this is another dimension that I think is important, which is how do emotions connect to spaces. Because all of the experiences that our three speakers actually talked about, there's a lot of human emotion. There's this connection between humans and space cannot be explained except through this point. So I was wondering if you could reflect on that theme, and it's open actually for all the speakers.
Yeah, colonial cities. Dublin is a good example of that, and of how that identity as a colonial city has been intensely contested, actually. Dublin's high point, well, Charlie knows as well, because he lived in Dublin for some time, but Dublin's high point is Dublin goes into is the second city of the empire in the 18th century, and this when all this beautiful Georgian architecture, all these great Georgian buildings are constructed, and goes into a terminal decline after the Act of Union is passed and the Parliament is closed. And one of the interesting things about post-independent Dublin is the way in which manifestations of that colonial imperial past were vigorously contested and removed from the public space. So you have a whole series of royal statues that are blown up by Republicans in the 1920s, culminating with the blowing up of Nelson's Pillar in the centre of Dublin in 1966, as in the year of the 50th anniversary of the Easter Rising, but also the beautiful Georgian terraces of Dublin, which by the 20th century were tenement slums, but there are these beautiful Georgian houses. There's a lot of angst, national angst, invested in these spaces, and tearing these slums, these tenements down, and building the big tower blocks of the kind that I mentioned in Belfast, the classic 1960s tower blocks, is considered a virtuous national act. So I think Dublin as a colonial/imperial space, there's a lot of emotion bound up in that. So I absolutely identify with that point. And I think in how emotion is conveyed through cities is generally through some kind of trying to take ownership of public space in some way. I'm not sure, I'd be interested to hear what you think about that. How do we convey, or how do we recognise the emotional life of a city, or the emotional identity of a city? I think it's through some form of public performance. I mean, I think that's performed in some way or manifested in some way, through monuments, through public events, and through the public taking ownership of these great spaces.
Yeah, can I? So, well, we're thinking about the city as kind of an icon of power here, and of course, Venice was the metropolis, is the centre of its empire, extending on land and sea. And your remarks, Caoimhe, were making me think about the Venetian ruling class as being experts, really, at the staged performance of power and the control of the key central symbolic spaces, the Ducal Palace, St Mark's Square. The way the architectural programme there is strictly controlled, the iconographic content is strictly controlled, the ritual programme celebrating aspects of Venice's empire, designed to have this repeated performance of their position, their way of seeing themselves in the world. They're extremely powerful and influential, not just for informing the Venetian ruling class's own sense of identity, but also as a means of projecting that onto subject populations and to external observers as well. So they're acutely sensitive to that kind of thing.
As a travel writer, I think when you go and visit cities, and you've got, say, 2-3 days to try and get a sense of the place and a sense of its history, it's the public memorials that you tend to end up touring around, just by circumstances take you that way. So your sense of the historical feel to the city is governed by whoever put those memorials up. And I mean, going back to Dublin, as an English person who moved to Dublin, I found myself fascinated by the Easter Rising, because when I was at school, we never did any Irish history at school, probably for obvious reasons. But you'd go to the GPO, and which was the centre of the Rising and was destroyed inside, but the frontage is still the same, and you can still see the bullet scars on the pillars outside. And on the Daniel O'Connell statue at the end of O'Connell Street, you can still see bullet holes from the Easter Rising. And Moore Street, where the Rising came to an end, and where Patrick Pearse went and surrendered and handed over his sword, and handed over 2 onions, I think, as well. He had 2 onions in his pocket, and as part of the surrender, he handed the British brigadier, whoever he was, the sword and 2 onions. But that's really decrepit, really falling down, Moore Street. It's in a really working class part of Dublin, and it's got loads of vegetable markets and a kind of mobile phone unlocking shops, that kind of thing. Yeah, it's this great historical thing, and the building's really falling down. The house where they all ended up in. Yet there doesn't seem to be any great desire to preserve it on an official level, which I'm really surprised about, as someone who's come from the wrong side of that conflict and moved to the city and become fascinated by it, that it happened so close, and I was aware it happened, but I didn't know the full story behind it. So to see Moore Street falling down and there being no attempt to save it I thought that would be one of the great public memorials that the city would be really keen to preserve. But yeah, that baffled me. And there's sometimes a strange attitude in Dublin to the Easter Rising as well, because I wrote a book when I first moved there about my first year living in Ireland, and I wrote this chapter about going around the sites of the Easter Rising and being fascinated by it. And, it was an eye-opening thing for me because I wasn't aware of the whole story. And it got reviewed in the Irish Times, and the reviewer said something about he went to a few obvious places and covered things like the Easter Rising, and he put in brackets yawn. And I thought, how can you say yawn at one of the most defining incidents in the history of your city? Whichever side you're on, there's nothing yawning to make you yawn about the Easter Rising. But so yeah, it is. I think it's that whole story of who controls the narrative and who. But as a visitor with only 2 or 3 days in a city, you are, in a sense, dictated by whoever put these memorials there, because they're the things you go and see. You go and see the art gallery, you go and see the museum, and you go to the main square where there's memorials to various things that have happened, and that governs your experience of it and your grasp of the historical atmosphere, I think.
It strikes me that we do have 2 20th century Irish historians in the room. Is there a reason Moore Street's being let fall down?
Well, it actually.
Money for one.
Well, it is a national monument. It's designated as a national monument, but as you pointed out, it's really decrepit. There's a big controversy at the moment because planning permission has been granted to turn Moore Street into a shopping centre.
Oh, yeah.
Not that Dublin needs another shopping centre. There's about 5 within a stone's throw of Moore Street, and the developers apparently have planned to preserve that building or that room from where the rebel leaders made their surrender. The families, the relatives of the 1916 men are contesting this and hold protest meetings and try and get a meeting with the Taoiseach and with the various ministers. But there's a striking contrast between Moore Street, you're quite right, and the GPO. But interestingly, the GPO is still a functioning post office. It hasn't been museumised entirely, or even at all, really. It's still, you can still go in and post a letter, and then look at the bullet holes and enjoy yourself.
Thank you. Any other questions? Yes, please. And to you, this lady. Thank you. No, you just talk. It's not a microphone. It's just to record you.
Okay. Well, I have a question about how to keep balance between grand narrative and also personal experience. The kind of city, they have their own spirit and mentality. Jerusalem or Belfast, they have, or Venice also, they have their own history, grand narrative, which got constructed by governors. But how to keep balance between the grand narrative and local residents' experience? How to deal with these issues?
I'm happy to start. I don't really want to engage with the grand narrative of the city. I'm not trying to write a definitive study of Venice. I'm trying to write a counter I'm trying to address the history of ordinary people and can rely on the other scholars who looked at it. So my purpose is to get away from it. I do have another kind of narrative that I have to engage in, which is that broader narrative of economic, structural, legal changes across time. And I need to situate my stories within that. So I'm going to have to place them within that broader context, but I'm not going to try to address like a conventional narrative of the city and its kind of public image that it's trying to project, the kind of things that I was talking about to Abid just then. That's something I don't intend to do. In fact, the book is intended to go counter to it.
Yeah, I too am suspicious of these grand narratives. And I think it's interesting to juxtapose personal experiences against grand narratives and find out where they clash and contradict. And I think then you can understand a bit more about what it was like to live in that city. And these countercultures, which James is kind of hinting at, or these other narratives which just jar perhaps only a tiny bit. You don't have to be totally in conflict with the grand narrative, but maybe you just don't quite fit in the way that you think it might. I think those stories can help us to understand a bit more about the city, but I'm not telling the big story, the big sweeping story of how Belfast came to be. It's in the back of my mind, and I want to maybe try and assess my individual stories against that backdrop, but I'm not trying to retell it in any way.
The kind of things I do as well, my narrative is part of a bigger story. I mean, I've gone to a place for a particular reason or because I'm on a particular journey. So, and I've only got a limited amount of words to write about it and a limited amount of time there. So I'm not really going to achieve the history of Barcelona in 800 words in a relaxed, groovy yet informative way. But the prism I kind of look through is for a specific reason. Like I say, when I was doing the walk to Hastings, that was following King Harold's route, but I wasn't exclusively just thinking about King Harold. I'd pass through places like York or Lincoln, and I would just spot something that took my interest about that city, and for me that would open up that city for me. That would kind of, I don't do a lot of travel journalism, but I hate those kind of 24 hours in Barcelona or 10 great things to do in Madrid. I could never do that. But the kind of travel journalism I've done for magazines and newspapers is I found one thing. It might be a bar or it might be a picture on a wall that for me has suggested something about that city. But it's the work I do is different from the rest of the guys here in that A, I'm writing for a commercial audience, and B, I kind of I can be a bit of a magpie because people are following me on this journey. They're joining me on this overall journey. So if I spot something that's interesting, I write about it, and hopefully they'll find it interesting too. So I would never set out to capture the great story of a whole city, but I'd like to think I can try and find one small aspect of it, even if it's an object, a picture, a place, a view, that for me sums up my experience of that city and my impressions of that city, and would perhaps enhance my understanding of the history of that city.
I do wonder whether, this is probably an incredibly controversial thing to say, but whether there's something inherent about being interested in experiences of people in cities that sets you up against a grand narrative, because that interest in locality by its very nature kind of maybe focuses you on exceptions and individuals and communities. Plus, of course, you all gave examples where the grand narrative is quite well known, so maybe you can then set up a counter narrative more than if it's something very obscure. I don't know.
I think so. I mean, I would define my approach as micro-historical. This approach deliberately would set itself up in contrast to grand narrative, great big structural versions of change. That's the point of doing it.
I'm wondering whether the shuffling over here implied someone wanting to disagree.
Quick introductions a lot.
Yeah. But Claudia, can you?
Yeah.
Thank you.
No, for me, I understood the question differently, actually. But maybe that's because I think cities, again, have evoked different meanings. And you mentioned the example of Jerusalem, and I think one of the best illustrations of that kind of contrast between grand narrative and how people actually live in a place is Jerusalem. As someone who comes from there, it's a normal Ottoman city traditionally up till very recently, and after that it's still a small Mediterranean city. But people think of it as some eternal, I don't know what, yeah, and they come and treat that space as such. And you have that narrative can end up actually transforming and destroying the space sometimes. So when you read 19th century travelogues like Mark Twain's *The Innocents Abroad*, yeah, which was a best-selling book back then, he came to Jerusalem being disappointed. He was like, "This is the land of Solomon," and I don't know what. And look at these pathetic inhabitants with flies over them, and these bazaars and weird people selling vegetables and filthy Arabs. What is this place? And he said it's not befitting for Jerusalem to be inhabited by people like that. Now, these are the people that built the place. They're the people that lived in the place. They're the people that ran the place. But it's not theirs, because the grand narrative is what matters about it. And I think there's a lot of cities, there's a select number of cities maybe sometimes that have that. But the question of meaning, the contrast between local experience and what perception from that imposed narrative from outside has to do also with imagined geography. And this is a big thing. I think you had something?
I'm sorry.
No, because you were nodding your head. You wanted to say something.
No, I mean, it's not, I'm just thinking, in terms of abandoning the project of trying to write the history of the city as a whole, whether we are missing the way in which it's been imagined. And this is really second our best point. I think Van Dyck Anderson's idea of the imagined community is actually a fantastic way to think about urban history, think about kind of the way meaning, identity is forged, and that gets us into the realm of myth making and storytelling. And I think what you're doing is fantastic. But I wouldn't abandon the project of trying to think about the way cities are captured as totalities as well.
But what you've both said comes back to the tension between how the cities are imagined and how they are lived. Have I understood you? Well, I understood that bit. Have I understood you correctly?
Yeah, I suppose as well. I mean, I was thinking in a way. Sorry. These are different ways of writing urban history. I mean, we've got the kind of micro-history of a space that Charlie's talking about, which I think is incredibly rich with potential. James, you're really talking about a series of relationships here, right? And how space and social identity can be constructed through these credit relationships. Your case, you're beginning with following the story of a single woman through urban space. I think these are brilliant, but I mean, to me, the urban history has the potential to explore interrelationships as well, to think about these connections. So to think about how somewhere like Silvertown is embedded in a series of relationships, other parts of London as well. And I just wonder how we can kind of explore those connecting points as well, which means stepping outwards and thinking about the city as totality, or thinking about how London is embedded in relations of its own with other cities around the world. And I mean, really, that gets so big. But I think potentially that's what makes urban history to me so rich with potential.
Surely the point, the conclusion has to be there's no one way of doing urban history. There's lots of different angles that you can access it through.
For those in the room that don't know, I feel bound to point out that Andrew is an urban historian of 19th century Philadelphia. I think was there a question over here?
Yeah.
At the thank you, Claudia.
Thank you. Okay, so this is to Venice, completely different topic. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think there was, during one of the Crusades, I think it's the Fourth Crusade, the Crusaders owed Venice a lot of money, and they couldn't pay it back, and so the Doge demanded they sack Constantinople, and they sacked Constantinople. And taken on, scaling down a bit, this is an ordinary story of debt, and the debtor couldn't pay, and it's a simple story of, it was demanded to sort of pay up some other compensation. But this, it goes to show the macro level of Venice as massive economic power. And it kind of seems like a sort of extension of everyday notions of debt and fraud and obligation, etc. And I was wondering how, you all seem to sort of go for a micro-historical approach, and I was wondering how, sort of in cases like these, the very micro-level stories and occurrences and narratives that occur again and again stretch to a macro level that isn't overarching but just scaled up.
Yeah, it's a really good question. Thank you. Although I do have this micro-historical focus, I was trying to suggest in my answer before, this does have to be situated within this great narrative. Now so for example, the 17th century Venice that I'm studying is going through a major transition of its power. It's no longer going to, at the start of the century, it's still the centre of Mediterranean trade, but the Dutch and the English and the French are starting to make inroads into its commerce. By the end of the 17th century, it's become a peripheral player in terms of European politics and economy too. There's a general background of continual warfare against the Ottoman Empire. These are really important kind of structural factors that have to be borne in mind in interpreting the micro level of story. So there is a tension here that has to be addressed, and I have to understand the individual stories and lives that I'm studying within that broader context and use that as an explanatory force. That doesn't, but it's not kind of the main focus of the research to address that. I'm not addressing kind of new sources to explore the history of those changes. I'm going to have to rely on secondary work of other scholars to do that. So my contribution is to open up this particular level, never been studied before, and place it in relationship to those other narratives and maybe help to understand them in a different way. Think about the impact of these great changes in world markets and power struggles. Well, what kind of actual impact does that have at base level? Did that help to answer the question?
Did you want to say something? Just kind of intake of breath.
I think I would. The point I would like to make is that for me, my macro focus is not urban history at all. It's how individuals have participated in terrorism or political violence over the 19th, 20th, 21st centuries, and it's almost. It's a happy coincidence that I'm on this panel, but and it reflects the fact that much of that political violence has taken place in urban environments. But I don't think of myself as an urban historian at all, and I'm speaking to a different and engaging with a different set of literature on the macro level. So that's my caveat.
Did you have anything you wanted to do? You don't?
No.
I think James, question?
Listening to the three speakers, and actually knowing some of the other historians and their interest in urban history, would it be fair to say that fundamentally the study of urban history and the attraction of it is turbulence, and that these are environments that result in greater human interaction and greater turbulence than, for example, more rural history, more rural settings, and that's really where the interest lies, and perhaps that's a huge and horrible generalisation about the study of history. But if you look at Sheffield, for example, turbulence here starts arguably 937 with the Battle of Runner, although I think you probably haven't still know what you call it. But more modern times, the steel industry, there's tremendous turbulence for the environment, for the geography of the city, tremendous turbulence then, through class development, class conflict. 1920s, we have communist riots here. The 1940s, and there's Charlie's stories of London. There's the bombing at Sheffield during the Blitz, we get the 1970s, steel miners strike first into the 1980s, we have the coal miners strike, and even then, you know, and events that resonate today, you know, those events still resonate today, but, you know, we then, you know, this year was the anniversary of the Hillsborough disaster, which continue to have implications for Sheffield today. They're all the story of turbulence. You look at other cities, and I mean, a good example maybe is of York and Leicester. York's incredibly important in, you know, in the first, you know, the first millennium Roman history. It's important from the Anglo-Saxon perspective in York and the Vikings. Tremendous turbulence. That kind of stops in the second millennium. Have a look at Leicester, again, an important Roman city, an important Saxon city, but you know, what's its history since then? Has tremendous social history, but more recently of migration, but there's a big gap, and perhaps that answers the big fight that the two cities are having at the moment over Richard III and his remains. You know, there's an attempt there to seek that turbulence in history and to make a claim there for that turbulence. And you know, when I think of the cities in Britain that have been studied, I'm sorry to offend anybody from there, but Worcester. And I remember the tremendous turbulence events in the mid-90s when Tom Moody and Graham Hick put on one of the finest one-day writing stands in a world record-breaking one-day win for Worcester. So it's about 300 runs in 50 overs. But I kind of struggle to see, you know, any other turbulence there. And you know, would and it is a horrible generalisation, but is that the attraction of cities? Is it the turbulence, the fact that you're putting people into a very, you know, into a confined environment and just watching people bounce off each other? Is that the attraction that cities do not have that history of turbulence? You know, is that less attractive?
Well, it is for me. The only reason I'm interested in cities is because violence takes place there. So I absolutely sympathise with that, but I'm sure the other speakers have a more nuanced answer.
Well, I'm attracted to working on Venice because of its incredibly rich documentary record, and that actually gives us the possibility to do the kind of work that I'm doing, and it's very difficult to find a documentary record like this. Italian city-states in general were quite precocious in recording this amount of information. They're kind of the first bureaucratic states of Western Europe. And this is also mirrored by people's private archiving, that people kept an incredible amount of private records at home, accounts and memory books, letters. It's a really documentary society. People like to write the stuff down. This will also happen later in the rest of early modern Europe. So it's about the documentary record, and I think the documentary record exists because of a legal culture that reflects the great mobility of urban life, which I think is one of its attractions. So it's mobile in terms of migration, as you mentioned. All cities have to suck in large numbers of migrants just to survive. This gives them a cosmopolitan mix, but also means, in social terms, it's difficult to tell where people are from and who they are exactly. And this opens up possibilities of social mobility, chance to move up and down the social hierarchy, and generates forms of anxiety about how to maintain and construct one's status. So this means, in turn, we have a situation where the ability to project oneself through time to resist change is actually an aspect of class that I'm talking about. So elites, for example, they adopt all the strategies possible to transmit and project their property, their assets, and their values through to the next generation. The ability to do that gives them superior bargaining power compared to those below them. So it's about managing one's position in time. Are you able to adopt strategy, or are you just responding to the day-to-day demands? And that's one of the things I'm trying to bring out in this very rich documentation. So this kind of partly answered your question. I'm interested in turbulence from the point of view of mobility, And I'm interested in cities because of the documentary record that exists in an attempt to control those forces of mobility.
I kind of can see it from both sides in the kind of things I've done and I'm doing. And the reason I walked to Belgium wasn't because I walked past the corner shop and kept going. I'm writing a book at the moment about a great uncle of mine who was killed at the end of the First World War, and so I was walking from the place he was born in northwest London. I was walking to his grave in Flanders, and I passed through obviously cities like Ypres, is the main example. And I mean, if ever there's a town that's defined by turbulence, it's probably Ypres. And when you go to Ypres, you go to the Menin Gate, and it's there, and it's all very moving. But it's in the ramparts, and if you walk around the ramparts, it's actually a really pleasant walk around the ramparts of Ypres. And there are these little information boards that are about, this was where the emperor had his ice house for the, and there's all these little boards, and you're kind of thinking, right, and you walk on to the next one, because when you're in Ypres, you're so focused on the First World War, inevitably, I mean, I was there as a result of writing a book related to the First World War, but it was kind of interesting to see these little boards in Ypres saying, there is more to us than that, As it turned out, it wasn't very interesting, but not to me anyway. But I don't think there's a book in great ice houses of Europe. But I found that interesting because it was like they were trying to say, it was like it's almost like a daisy under a big hedge. It's like there is more to us than this, but we can't get through this big thicket of stuff about the First World War. But then obviously, tourism is one of their big draws. It's why people come, and the tourism draw is the First World War. But at the same time, the books I write are thematic. I go to places for a reason, not specifically to tell a story of a city. So like I went around the areas of the shipping forecast, so I look at the area of the shipping forecast, I choose somewhere to go, and I was governed by that map. So the stories I had to tell about places there were not necessarily inspired by turbulence. There could be just an interesting local person there, and I'm a firm believer that wherever you go, anywhere in the world, city, village, a field, whatever, there's a story there somewhere, and if you dig deep enough, you'll find it. And I've found, I've been to some fairly obscure places and always found interesting stories, and not always related to turbulence. There's only one place that nearly defeated me, and that was a town called Hanstholm in Denmark, which I did for my shipping forecast book, and it's sea area Fisher, which only gives you a little bit of Danish coastline to work with. And so I went to Hanstholm, and I thought my theory that everywhere's got an interesting story, so I'll find something in Hanstholm. Didn't really. To give you an idea how boring Hanstholm was, the name Hanstholm comes from an old, I think it's a Norse phrase, Hanskeholm, which means the inlet of the glove. And the story goes that many years ago a woman dropped a glove there, and that's the story. But I got way off the question there. But
Did the boredom then become the story?
It did, yeah, because there's a shopping centre and a hotel, and that's it. And the shopping centre's only got about 3 shops in it, and a pub called King Henry's Pub for some reason. And I noticed that 3 days I was there, every time I went into King Henry's Pub, the same guys were in the same place at the bar. And obviously I was in the bar as well to notice that, so they were probably thinking the same about me. But I got way off the question there. But I think my approach is possibly quite different, because I'm not trying to tell the story of one place. I'm telling a themed story that involves a journey through these places, and that gives me the luxury of not being constricted into a particular subject area of research. I can, to an extent, pick and choose my stories, but they are governed by the journey I'm making and the overall story I'm trying to tell.
I think we can probably take one more question. That's
I thought it was really interesting to hear how you connect your own personal experiences of the contemporary city with these kind of historical stories and narratives. And, I have a question about how you document the city as a kind of researcher or a writer. You're obviously all writing books, and your work is going to lead to something that's written in the form of a book. I kind of wondered if, when you're visiting cities or researching cities, whether you take photographs, whether you create new maps, whether you have a travel diary. Are there other kind of forms of research, communication, documentation, visualization that inform the writing and your relationship between writing and the city, particularly given that it's the city that you're looking at and you're speaking about these very kind of visual things like this rubber that's seeping into these old holes, bullet holes, things like that.
I'll go for it. Yeah, I think it's a very interesting question. I did once make a film that was designed to look like anything except Venice. So we deliberately chose bits of Venice that never appear on postcards or documentaries. And it was quite a success from that point of view. In my current work, I'm afraid I haven't demonstrated that kind of imagination, but I can refer you to an old friend of mine, John Walker, who is someone who experiments with form in how to tell the story of a city, and he's told it, for example, through the use of cartoon imagery. So working with a cartoonist, a graphic artist who represent Venice in the form of what look like old woodcuts. Yeah, but he's using that to tell his story. Well, another of his projects has involved a lot of Polaroid camera work, so deliberately choosing an archaic technology to go and take pictures of, say, Venetian brickwork close up. And this is part of his kind of visual attempt to demonstrate the material structure of the city. So it's certainly possible to do this kind of work. I'm afraid I haven't really shown that much imagination.
Although you do appear in the book.
I do appear in the book, yes.
I take photographs when I go to do research, but only for private use, and have them on social media and things like that. And usually they're pictures of archives. So I have this strange collection of archives. But one of the complications is that an individual's personal archive might not be in the city in which they lived. So frequently you have to go to another city to read about someone's life in the first city, which is an interesting kind of tension as well. But yeah, I can tell you a lot about, I'm sure everyone, all the historians in this room has a kind of pecking order of nice cities to visit for the archives, or nice archives to visit. But again, I don't share that publicly outside of social media.
I'm quite old-fashioned, a bit of a Luddite. So I literally use a notebook and a pencil when I travel. I do take photographs sometimes, but only as kind of aid memoir rather than, oh, that's a pretty thing. It'll be like a plaque on a wall. I think, well, rather than write all that down, I'll just take a picture of it. But one thing I find interesting in the whole writing process is there'll be things I've written in my notebook that I've scribbled about at length that I think that's really important. That'd be a really good part of that particular chapter. But then when I get home and 3 or 4 weeks later I'm writing it all up, suddenly in the context of the way I'm writing it, that stuff is not relevant at all. It's usually a really bad joke. I think that's what I'm thinking of there. But it is. I wonder how maybe there's opens up something else in that your perception on the spot of where you are and you're making notes is somehow changed when you're away from that spot and interpreting it and translating it into words and writing it for an audience. So it's quite interesting going back through old notebooks as well and seeing the bits that I left out and wondering why I left out. And sometimes it's obvious why I left them out because they're terrible jokes. But that's got me thinking about that now because is your perceptions on the spot, are they worth more than your considered perception when you're away from that spot and still writing up? I don't know.
I have to say, I find that kind of reassuring that none of you actually do that, because I've been sitting here, I work by default on a city, Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital, because it's an urban culture. I'm not an urban historian, but it's an urban culture, but it's a city that doesn't exist anymore. It's an almost entirely imagined city. And I've been sitting here thinking I must be missing out on something by not being able to go and experience that space, but it appears that in fact everybody is kind of imagining the city through the archives in one way or another, or through their own writings. Unless anybody had a burning question, I think probably an hour and a half is about most people's tolerance for those chairs. So I'm going to, let me first, before I thank our speakers, thank Dom and Claudia for their technical assistance and Nick for practical assistance, which is much appreciated, and everybody for coming and for such an interesting and lively discussion. That was really fascinating. Can we please thank our speakers, Charlie, James and Caoimhe, for what was really a very, very interesting discussion, I think. Thank you so much.